Gray's Garage.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Gray's Garage with me, Gray. Now today is a pretty special episode. It's the first time here we're going to be applying all these aerodynamic concepts to a real world situation. And this is coming about because a friend of mine, David Worrell, sent me an email saying, you know what, Gray, I loved your videos. I race a car and I would like to make some aerodynamic modifications. Can you help me out? And because he was the first one to approach me, he got priority and I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So he races in the Improved Production Championship in Australia. The track he was specifying, I don't know if this is the same one, is the Mount Panorama Bathurst. Specifically, he was concerned about a high-speed turn which you take at approximately 230 kilometers an hour, which is crazy. And so he really wanted to improve his downforce for that stability while taking that high-speed turn. So sent me an email. He said, you know, Graham, I'd like to try and improve my downforce, improve my traction. You know, I saw one of your older videos on Gurney Flaps, and I made that video several years ago, and he thought he could apply that to his own car. And what would it do? And I said, you know what? That's a great incentive for me to revisit Gurney Flaps and to talk about them a little bit more and to apply them to a real world situation. So let's talk about his car a little bit. He has a 1982 Holden Commodore. And now there's different series of Commodores, and he has one of the earlier ones, the VH chassis. It's about 1,300 kilograms. He has a 5.7 liter LS1, putting it about 430 horsepower. Crazy, crazy for such an old light car, but that's why he's racing it, right? So we had some additional ideas, you know, modifying. Could we modify the stock spoiler? Do we want to change the, you know, to a different OEM spoiler? The original stock spoiler looks like this. A different Commodore came with another spoiler that looks like this, and he was thinking maybe switching between the two would improve his downforce, or, you know, adding a Gurney flap. Could we add a Gurney flap to one of these spoilers and increase our rear wheel traction? So the first step when applying aerodynamics or any sort of modification to your car is to do your research. So that was my responsibility because, you know, I'm coming from the aerodynamics side, so researching into the vehicle. And as I said before, there were about 3 series that I could get my hands on here around his age for the car. That was the VH, which was 1981 to 1984. No aerodynamic data on that car I could find online, so unfortunately that was a little bit of a downer, but fortunately the next series, the VL, 1986 to 1988, very similar in appearance to the VH, and it did have some data. So it has a coefficient of drag of 0.41 to 0.43. That's pretty high. You know, standard cars these days are around 0.3 or lower. 0.4 to 4.3, that's pretty high, and that's because of this boxy sedan shape that the Commodore is using. There's an extra, another series even newer, which is the VN, 1988 to 1991. Coefficient of drag dropped here to 0.34, and it looks like the designers paid a little bit more attention to the aerodynamics and made it a little bit sleeker, didn't have those sharp corners, and reduced the drag. Now the cool thing is, while doing my research, the VL and the VN were raced professionally in the Group A, and the VL in particular has a really cool, I don't know what I can call it, but it was modified by a shop called Walkinshaw, and the body kit for this is really cool. I got a picture of it here, I got a couple pictures actually, and they added a front air dam with a small plate at the front there to increase the downforce at the front. They have a bonnet vent to increase your cooling airflow through the engine bay, slotted side skirts, you have a rear raised deck lid. Now this is the most interesting thing, and this is what really changed the drag on this car, because as I mentioned, the older Commodores had that really sharp sedan notch, and by adding that spoiler, they decreased the angle at the back there, and they reduced the drag to a coefficient of drag of 0.32. And it has this wraparound spoiler too, so it was really cool, seeing this Walkinshaw and seeing that people have already looked at the Commodore before, so there's definitely some room for improvement. What can we do to make David's car a bit better? on race day. So step number 2 is looking at the limitations. Now David sent me the race day rules. I printed out the relevant sheet which talks about rear deck spoilers, and there's a few things that we have to work, in between. So anytime you modify your car, you want to make sure that it's within regulations, or else you're going to be disqualified. So you can either stick with a standard OEM spoiler, or if you want to modify or do your own spoiler, you have to follow certain rules here. The spoiler at no point can be further than 125 millimeters from the original bodywork, so it can't be crazy high, can't be sticking out. It actually can't be extended past any point at the original body, so that's going to be the rear bumper. It can't go further than the rear bumper backwards, and it can't go further forward than the rear axle. So it's kind of constrained in the position where it can be, and it can't be crazy high or crazy big. It also can't be wider than the car, obviously. So working within these regulations, it looks like, if we want to do a new spoiler, or we want to modify the original OEM spoiler, a Gurney flap is kind of a good option. It's easy to make, easy to implement, and it can follow within these regulations. So the next thing here was to produce a model for testing. Now, we looked online, we couldn't really find any die-cast models or any, hobby models that I could use in the water channel for this particular car. It's not really a performance sports car, the 1982 Holden Commodore. So I actually got David to measure the relevant angles on his car, and I got, a diagram here. This is just the rear end angles using a digital protractor, because some of the main angles, the windshield bonnet junction, the rear windshield to the trunk angle, those are really what's going to affect the aerodynamics. So I really needed to know those angles to produce a car. So I actually produced a CAD model. I had the first version, and then I wasn't happy with it, so I went with a little bit nicer second version. I got some pictures here, and I actually 3D printed it. So I have the model here, just 3D printed it in the lab, and as you can see, it's relatively simple, but it contains all the relevant geometrical features, and most importantly the angles, because for a sedan-like shape, it's the angles which is going to really affect the overall flow structure, your lift and your downforces. So, and in particular, since we're looking at the rear end here, the rear angles were the most important. So I'm not sure what scale this car model is. I think it's somewhere between 1:24 to 1:18. I can go measure it and put it up here on the video afterwards, but fair size, good size model to put in the water channel and make some measurements. I also reproduced the stock spoiler that David has on the car currently, and then also the modified spoiler with the Gurney flap, and we're gonna, I tested it with and without this modified spoiler to see what the effect was. So the final step after all this preparation is put in place is to actually do the experiments and figure out the conclusions. So I actually did 2 different techniques. So if you've seen all my other videos, you've seen the hydrogen bubble. It's really great at visualizing the flow, but it's a little bit hard to quantify, how much better is the flow in terms of producing downforce or reducing drag. And where this next technique really steps in is to produce this quantitative data. So it's called PIV, or particle image velocimetry, and I'm going to make a video on this in the future describing exactly how it works. But essentially it uses a laser and some cameras to measure particle displacement, sort of like the hydrogen bubbles. And you figure out all your velocity vectors, and you can actually see the flow quantitatively around the car geometry. So I did both the hydrogen bubble and PIV for the clean stock OEM spoiler and the stock OEM spoiler with the Gurney flap, and the results we're going to look at now, and the conclusions are quite surprising.
We begin by looking at the clean baseline flow, with only bubbles being produced upstream to the left. Here we're visualizing the flow along the center line of the vehicle. We begin by looking at the front of the vehicle, where we can see a stagnation point near the middle of the front bumper. The flow moves smoothly along the front bonnet, front windscreen, and over the top of the roof. Where things get really interesting is near the rear of the vehicle. Here the flow cannot follow the sharp corner at the rear windshield and leaves the surface of the vehicle. We can see that sometimes it appears that the bubbles reattach at the aft end of the trunk, forming a close separation bubble that sometimes appears to open and let some flow downstream. However, to get a closer look, we need to turn the bubbles on at the surface of the rear of the vehicle. Let's do that now. Now we have both the bubbles being produced upstream, as well as bubbles being produced on the surface of the vehicle at the rear. Again, we can see a sharp delineation between the two different types of flow. The high-speed flow coming from upstream is moving very quickly, and the bubbles blur together. However, the flow being caught in separation bubbles at the rear of the vehicle move more slowly and also in a more turbulent fashion. We can sometimes see individual bubbles because they're moving more slowly, and we can also see that there's a very circular motion to their movement. This is due to the fact that they're caught in separation bubbles, which are highly turbulent wakes. Let's now turn off the bubbles upstream to make the wake regions clearer. Here we're visualizing only the rear wakes. And again, we can see that the highly turbulent mixing motion of the bubbles caught in these separation bubbles. Another thing that was noted before is that sometimes it appears that the separation bubble, forming over the rear trunk and rear windshield, sometimes opens up and lets bubbles out. And this can be clearly seen occurring in an unsteady manner. Along the rear of the car, near the rear taillights, we also have separation bubble, with recirculation and turbulent mixing. This can also be seen to be shedding some large packets of bubbles irregularly. Let's now zoom in to get a closer look. Since we are now zoomed in, let's talk about the flow structures that are occurring near the rear of the vehicle. Above the rear trunk and rear windshield, we have a single separation bubble with a clockwise orientation of rotation. This bubble appears closed at some times and then open at others. When it opens, it lets bubbles out, which move downstream. Along the back face of the vehicle, near the rear taillights and rear bumper, we have a complicated situation where it appears there may be one or two small separation bubbles. The more dominant bubble, however, is the one with the counterclockwise orientation of rotation, which is the lower one, and we can see that this sheds downstream periodically. So how does this change when we add the stock OEM spoiler? Let's take a look. We now have the stock OEM spoiler attached to the rear trunk. As before, we only have the bubbles being produced upstream on currently, and the flow moves smoothly around the front of the vehicle, and where things change a little bit is near the rear. As we can see, the bubbles seem to be angled up slightly as they leave the top of the rear windshield. There also seems to be some unsteadiness occurring just downstream of the rear spoiler. It appears we still have a recirculation bubble above the rear trunk, but let's turn on the bubbles on the surface of the vehicle to get a closer look. We now have both bubble sources on, and as we can see, it looks very similar to that before without the stock OEM spoiler. However, perhaps the separation bubble above the rear trunk and rear windshield is a little bit bigger, extended downstream slightly more, and the separation bubbles occurring along the back face near the rear trunk, rear bumper seem a little bit different, and the flow moving over the top roof seems to be angled up slightly, not angled down towards the ground so sharply. However, to get a look at this rear structure, we really need to turn the bubbles off upstream and zoom in. Let's do that now. With the camera zoomed in near the rear of the vehicle, we can see that the stock OEM spoiler does indeed change the flow structures. The separation bubble occurring above the rear trunk and rear windshield appears to be closed at all times, not letting any bubbles out that move downstream. It still has a clockwise orientation of rotation, however. Near the rear surface of the vehicle, near the rear taillights and rear bumper, we do see that there are two distinct separation bubbles. The upper one with a clockwise orientation of rotation, which is smaller, and the lower one, which is occurring due to the flow coming from below the vehicle, with a counterclockwise orientation of rotation. Let's now see what adding the Gurney flap does to change the flow structure. We now compare all three cases: clean, stock OEM spoiler, and stock OEM spoiler with Gurney flap. Again, we only have the bubbles upstream being produced. And we can see that between the clean case and the spoiler, that the flow is deflected upwards near the rear of the vehicle. It's not moving sharply down towards the ground as much. and this indicates that more downforce is being produced in both spoiler cases. However, the difference between the Gurney flap and the regular spoiler isn't so apparent. One very interesting thing can be seen, however. The high-speed flow moving around the vehicle can be seen to become unsteady just downstream of the stock OEM spoiler. This is indicated by the unsteadiness located here in this video. Looking at the identical region in the video with the Gurney flap, we don't see this unsteadiness, indicating that the flow is changing less in time with the Gurney flap added. Now this may not translate to less drag, but it will translate to more stability. We need to look closer to see any major differences. We now focus in on just the case with the Gurney flap. We have both bubbles being produced on the surface and bubbles being produced upstream. As before with the stock OEM spoiler, the separation bubble above the rear trunk and rear windshield is closed. It doesn't open and let bubbles out downstream. This is clear due to the large bubbles being produced on the surface that are just staying there. They're moving around a little bit due to the unsteadiness, but they're not being shed downstream. The rear of the wake, near the rear taillights and rear bumper, does seem to be a little bit different than the stock OEM case. However, we needed to zoom in to get a better look. Let's do that now. Here we can clearly see the flow structures near the rear of the vehicle. As before, the separation bubble above the rear trunk and rear windshield is closed and has a clockwise orientation of rotation. Near the rear of the vehicle, near the rear taillights and rear bumper, we do see some differences. The separation bubbles seem to be a little bit larger than before. We do have a clockwise orientation of rotation near the top and a much larger counterclockwise orientation of rotation separation bubble at the bottom, coming off from the flow underneath. To really see the differences between the stock OEM spoiler and the stock OEM spoiler with the Gurney flap, we really need to look at the PIV. We need to go into the quantitative data and pull out the main differences. So let's stop with the hydrogen bubble now and move on to PIV to see if we can draw any hard conclusions. We now look at PIV. The field of view for the camera is that shown in the image here, looking at the top roof, back windshield, back trunk, generally the rear flow structures. And this is for the clean geometry. The flow is from the left to the right, and the way PIV works is that we're stitching together thousands of images looking at in this case, the velocity magnitude, that's the speed of the flow, where blue is very slow moving flow and red is very fast moving flow. And we also have drawn some velocity vectors, which are the arrows showing the direction of the flow motion. As we can see along the back trunk and back windshield, we do have that separation bubble with the clockwise orientation of rotation, and we know this is a separation bubble because the flow is very slow moving, it's blue, and we can see through the vectors that it's rotational and unsteady. It's changing very drastically in time. So generally, to gauge the size of our separation wake, we look at the areas of slow moving flow. That would be the blue areas in this case. And we can see that it's changing very drastically in shape and size and time. And the big thing here is we can see, as we saw in the hydrogen bubble, that the upper separation bubble is letting go. It's actually opening up and letting go of some of that slow moving flow in an unsteady manner, and that flow is being shed downstream. So this unsteadiness is really indicating that we're going to have changing forces in time. So this is important for the driver, especially at high speed, because this will translate to buffeting. When the forces are changing very drastically, very quickly, you're going to start to feel the car shake around, and you can lose control. So let's now see what happens when we add the OEM spoiler. We're now looking at the PIV with the same field of view, however we have the OEM spoiler attached along the rear trunk. Now as we can see, we still have a large separated wake, indicated by the blue slow moving flow, and with the arrows we can see that we do have some recirculation above the upper rear trunk, and this is that circular separation bubble. And along the rear of the vehicle we do have some separation bubbles as well. But the main difference here between the previous no spoiler case and this case is the steadiness of that separation bubble. It's not changing very drastically in shape and size and time. And so, although the drag values may not have changed very much, the unsteadiness and the buffeting experienced by the driver in time will be much, much less with this stock spoiler in place. Now, this is the reason why you see stock spoilers on many, many vehicles, even modern vehicles, especially SUVs. They want to fix the separation point, and they want to control the steadiness of the separated wake so that the driver doesn't feel buffeting and lose control of their vehicle. Another thing we can see that we saw in the hydrogen bubble videos is that the separation bubble over the rear trunk and rear windshield appears to be mainly closed. It doesn't open up very often to let some of that low speed flow move downstream. It does happen occasionally, but much less than the case without the stock OEM spoiler in place. So what's going to happen now when we add the Gurney flap to the stock spoiler? Well, let's take a look. We now have the Gurney flap in place along the stock rear spoiler. Now, as we saw in the hydrogen bubble, the flow structure seems very similar to the case with the stock OEM spoiler. We have a much more stable separation bubble along the rear trunk and rear windshield, and the locations of the separated wake seem to be in the same locations. They don't seem to be changing very much. We still have recirculation bubbles in the same locations as before. So really, what has changed here? What has the Gurney flap done? Well, the purpose of the Gurney flap was to try and increase the downforce at the rear axle. So to really see this, we need to compare them side by side, and we also need to see the vertical component of the velocity, because right now we're looking at the velocity magnitude, which is the speed, but we also need to see the direction.
So now that we have the PIV data, we want to get an estimate of how the lift and drag on the Commodore is changing as we add the OEM spoiler and the Gurney flap. And so we didn't actually make proper force measurements using something called a force balance, which I've made a video about previously. We just have PIV along the center line. And so we're going to be using something called a momentum balance to get an estimate for these lift and drag force changes. We're going to be using some very simplifying assumptions, so this is not necessarily accurate. It's just an estimate to see how things are changing. So quickly, just to explain what I'm doing and to give you an example, I'm going to lay it out here. So let's say we have a more conventional lift producing device, which is an airfoil. So let's draw it here. Okay. And we have a coordinate system. We're looking at a two-dimensional airfoil. It's going to be X and Y, so 2 dimensions. Initially, we have the airfoil, flying through the air, and we have a free stream, constant free stream velocity approaching at U1. Now, because of the influence of this airfoil, this free stream velocity and free stream flow, which is initially all in the X direction, so it's all moving in the X direction, is going to be changed. And this is by the presence of the airfoil, and this is going to produce a lift and drag force. So if we look at the X momentum, which is the momentum in the X direction, due to the presence of this airfoil, the free stream flow is going to be slowed down, and the X momentum coming off in the wake, U2, is going to be lower than U1 because of a drag force. And so by looking at the change in the X momentum, upstream and downstream of the airfoil, we can get an estimate here of how much drag is being produced by this airfoil and influencing the flow around it. The other direction is the Y direction, and this is the lift force. So initially, we have our free stream flow coming in with no Y momentum. It's not moving up or down. But due to the presence of this airfoil, it's going to be redirected. And so airfoils are actually really good at this, redirecting the flow downwards. And so this is going to be producing a negative Y momentum here, or downwards Y momentum. And this is going to be producing a lift force. So when you actually do this properly with a proper control volume, you need to look at some pressure forces and stuff like that too. I didn't measure pressure, so I'm just going to be ignoring that. So some very simplifying assumptions. This is two-dimensional. This is a steady approximation, so no change in time. But just generally, what's happening here is a free stream flow is being slowed down in the x direction, that's drag, and it's also being changed in orientation, and that's lift. So if we look at how the y momentum and the x momentum is changing, we can get an idea of how our lift and drags are changing. So that's what we can do really easily with the PIV. So let's just take a look now at a car. So you may not know, but most cars actually produce lift instead of downforce. So if we have, let's say, a conventional vehicle, let's say it's whatever it is. It could be a Ford Focus, who knows? Doesn't matter. We have the free stream flow as before coming in. We have our coordinate system, y up and x in the free stream direction. And most vehicles actually look very similar if you just boil down their geometry to an airfoil. We have a flat bottom and a curved upper surface, and so what actually happens is, just like an airfoil, we get some redirection of this initial x momentum flow in the y direction, and this produces a lift force. And obviously, because cars produce large wakes, so the wake is a slow moving flow. And remember I said the drag is the change in the x momentum. So if we have an initially fast free stream and we have a very slow moving wake, which is going to be our U2, then the change in the x momentum is very large and we have a very large drag. And just a side note, this is the reason why cars produce a lot of drag compared to airfoils, because they produce a very large wake of low speed, low momentum flow, whereas an airfoil doesn't do this. An airfoil is very efficient at redirecting the flow without producing this low speed wake. So most cars produce lift. We have this reorientation of the flow in the y direction. So how do, now that we have our PIV with the spoiler and with the Gurney flap, how do we get an estimate here of how the lift and drag are changing? So if we just get rid of this stuff here and redraw our situation. So all cases are going to be producing lift and drag. Now, because this is a very bluff body, where all cases are going to have this low speed wake, and so they're all going to produce this drag. This is the U2. But how does this wake size change when we change the geometry? And so by looking at how this wake size changes, we're going to see how the drag is changing. And so I have some estimates here for that. And what we can see is that by adding the spoiler, we actually increase the wake size, we increase the drag. But the other thing is, as we saw before, that adding the spoiler increases the stability of the flow, which means it's not changing very much in time, and that's going to reduce your buffeting. It's going to make it easier for the car to be controlled by the driver at high speed, and that's most likely why you want to keep the spoiler on. Even though it increases your drag a little bit, it's making your car much more stable, and that's for safety, and that's why manufacturers use spoilers. When we add the Gurney flap, it's going to increase this wake even more, and as we see here, the drag increases more. So that's, as we expected, the influence of the car is being more apparent. We're slowing down the x momentum flow, causing more drag. Okay, that makes sense. What about the lift? So with the lift, let's just get rid of the wake here. Now with the lift, we're talking about how much are we reorienting this flow in the y direction, producing y momentum. So initially, when we have a clean Commodore, we're redirecting it down towards the ground, producing a lot of lift, as we can see here. When we add the spoiler, we actually end up redirecting some of that flow upwards in a more upwards direction, and we reduce the amount of lift that's being produced. As we can see here, that is the case. The OEM spoiler does reduce the lift. Adding the Gurney flap further causes this to be reoriented upwards, further reducing the lift. Now the estimates for these numbers, again, because of the simplifying assumptions here that I had to make, not necessarily accurate. So the percent changes here are not necessarily accurate. More so for the lift than for the drag. The drag is a little bit more accurate than the lift. But just generally looking at this, how is the momentum being changed? We can see that the Gurney flap is going to be the best at producing downforce or reducing the amount of lift that's being produced. Now some cars go so far as to produce positive downforce, which means that instead of reorienting the flow downwards towards the ground, we're actually going to reorient it upwards, away from the ground. And you can see this on some Formula One cars which have really aggressive rear wings. The flow is being thrown upwards. You can see this with, I think, water spray on Formula One cars where this flow is just being directed completely upwards, and that's that change in momentum towards the Y direction. And so moving the flow upwards produces a negative lift, which is also known as a downforce. So, in conclusion, what we've learned is that adding a spoiler increases your stability, but also increases your drag. Adding a Gurney flap increases your drag further, as expected, but it also increases your downforce, or reduces your lift. So, if you want to add a Gurney flap to your vehicle, you want to ask yourself, what do you need? Do you want to sacrifice a little bit of top-end speed for more stability and traction? You know, what's limiting you when you're racing? Is it traction or is it top speed? If it's top speed, you don't want to add a Gurney flap. If it's traction, which most likely is, then you should add a Gurney flap. It's going to increase your downforce. But keep in mind, these are how these things work, and it's not necessarily going to work as effectively for every vehicle. I would say that for this vehicle, it's not as effective as it would be for something else, say maybe a hatchback. And that's just because of the sedan shape. But in conclusion, we found that these modifications do make a difference, and they can affect how, the car behaves on race day. So I would recommend keeping the spoiler and adding a Gurney flap for that extra traction. Again, if you are interested in seeing how these things affect your own vehicle, please send me an email, go to my website, and if you'd like this video, please let me know, like and subscribe, and I will continue to make them.
Grays Garage.